messing with me. Thank you. All right, is that better? See it in both places, up here and on your Zoom session? That's what we want. Okay, so I would like to wait on this, but I think we're just going to go ahead because as slow as our computers have been, I'm going to kind of make sure everybody can get logged on. And then we'll kind of backtrack and work our way up to this point. So I'm jumping you ahead a little bit. Now, the software that we're going to use is SQL Management Studio. So let's find that on our start menu. Let me close my session down. And you might have two versions. So I'm going to stick with, on my end, that SQL Server Management Studio 18, because that should be the newest one. This software, remember, you're just going to find it out on the internet and download it free. You don't have to do any logging on to any Microsoft sites or anything to get this Management Studio. But 18 should be the newest one.
18.2 it looks like.
There's probably something newer out there since they come out so often. But this software doesn't change a lot, so you're okay if you don't have the exact same version. All right, so this is, I can't, I'm going to share the wrong screen with you because I can't move it. So you'll see it on your Zoom session, but we won't see it up here. Okay, you get the login screen to SQL Server Management Studio. Whenever you're using this Management Studio, you are just connecting to this database, to this server, to issue commands and create things and query data. So you're not, this is not really an end user tool. This is a programmer or software developer database administrator tool. So we'll see that it's a little bit different than some of the other tools that we use, but also a little bit the same. In your server name, we need that long server name that is on that setup page. So we want to copy this whole name, including the comma 1433. So I'm going to copy that whole thing. And then I'm going to paste it in my server name.
Once we get the right things installed, of course.
And then for your login, your login is going to be your username with your initials. And then your password is going to be just your login ID without your initials, just the number part. So this one is not going to be set up with your OTC password. It's just got that generic password that's your number. So let's see if you can get logged in.
Are we welcome and able to change that, or would you prefer us to just leave it as is?
You have to issue SQL commands to change it, so you're fine to leave it. Yes, sir?
It's not hard.
What's it telling you?
It says login failed for user ID. Username Microsoft SQL error 18456.
Make sure the next thing down asks you for the type of authentication we want to use. We need to use SQL Server authentication. So that's what, it's still giving that?
Yeah. Mine's just loading. Oh, no, show us the number. No such function. Yeah.
Let me find my password here. Okay, now let's see, we've got all the logins.
Bless you. Bless you.
Let me look at one and see if I can see why it won't let you guys log in. Because it looks like it should. You're there. So it's saying your account doesn't exist at all? Or is it saying it's invalid?
It says a login. It just says cannot connect. Mine says the server doesn't exist.
So do you guys feel like you're getting blocked from the server? Because we have issues with the network with them blocking this AWS server from us.
Maybe.
Do what?
I wonder.
Oh, it doesn't have permissions to connect this.
I'm going to send an email. Because I might have to send them our actual server name to get you guys' rules set up through the firewall so that you can get to it. So let me send it to the help desk and we'll see.
It means the error code is that we are putting the wrong credentials.
Oh, it is? Okay. Let's check that. And I'm being able to get to it. So that's, well, but I'm in staff, so it's just hard to know. Okay, Edward, I'm going to change your password. Yeah, and let's see if I got something wrong when I entered them. I'm just going to make it be your number again. 09 11 399. Yay.
Don't you have a staff account? No.
And make sure you guys leave out this stupid 0 in your password if your number starts with a 0. Sorry, that's what it is. It dropped all the zeros. That's what I get for using Excel, huh?
So let's be clear, just the first ones that happen to be
Just
zero,
the
not,
preceding zeros.
not all the zeros.
And preceding zeros.
And is that also just for our password or does that just?
Cool. And then the students are good. But you start before your.
No, I don't. I no. Anybody else on? Anybody else on yourself?
You can't either. Okay, now you use your Keller ME and your number. Good, good. Once you get in, you'll know what it is, and it's not a problem. It's just the first time. I know it. And I pulled it from Canvas, so it used your Canvas account. Okay, so try again, and then we might.
Oh yeah, this doesn't make sense.
There's another
All right. In our textbook, we have some data files and things that you can get. And you know, sometimes we download those things for you, but I wanted you to forge out there and find them. Let me switch screens for you. So you're going to go to Muroc.com, our textbook manufacturer's website. And Mahela was talking before class, people usually keep this book because it's kind of a little bit more than a normal textbook. It's kind of like a reference manual because it has a lot of good information for you. So I wanted you to be kind of familiar with their website. They do have some other programming books. And if you guys have looked at your book bill, they're pretty reasonably priced compared to some of the other textbook manufacturers, so you might like them. So I want to find our SQL book. So if I click on Shop Books, I'm going to go to Database Programming Books, maybe. And I want to make sure that I'm working with our SQL Server 2016 textbook. So they do have some other database textbooks.
I just remember too, I got a C# book.
Did you? Yeah, they're really good. And so a lot of people really, really like them. All right, as you scroll down then, once you found the SQL Server 2016 book, through downloads, and down at the bottom, you want to either download this exe file or the zip file, whichever one you would prefer. Now, when you get it downloaded, you can actually execute this, and all it does is load some files for you. So it'll load some student data files. Yes, sir?
It's asking us to write.
Did you try to download it?
Now.
You should be able to go ahead and do that. Let's use your OTC email address. So you don't have to get any emails from them to your personal life. Oh, what's your personal login? My daughter keeps yelling at me to delete my Yahoo account.
Look, both
You
sides
don't
have
think-
it.
no.
It's like a
I don't like
museum. The other side has it.
I
No, I'm saying, that one
I
also.
can't log on to that.
That one, they keep going. Yeah, it's like cars with it.
Now you should be able to download.
Yeah, we open it.
Yeah, go ahead and open it. Let's see if we can save it someplace.
How's that?
We want to save it to the C drive. If the system will let you just unzip it to the C drive like that, and then you'll have that Muroc folder on your computer.
But I think zip file. I downloaded the exe.
Sorry. Okay, use the zip. That's fine. Now, you guys, since we're putting it on the C drive, that means we'll lose it if they re-image the machine. So you're welcome to copy some of it to your H drive, but I don't think you need the whole thing on your H drive. I don't think it's super big, but we want to keep from junking that up. Now I'm going to get it downloaded too because I don't have it on this machine, I don't think anymore, because I had it on the H drive. And while I'm doing that, go ahead and take a look at the contents and see if you see any useful stuff. What we're going to do is we're going to use the scripts that they supply to create databases. I don't see any traffic light. Oh my gosh. It's like a zombie traffic light.
I thought we were gonna get a free book. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that too.
I didn't have 2 terabytes, but you're not good. I didn't know where I
Okay, when you look at that folder, you should be seeing some different folders in there. In your databases folder, this has the actual SQL commands to create the databases that they use in all of the examples and everything. So if I do ask, sometimes people want to install SQL Server at home and make all the databases themselves every once in a while. And so you could do that because you have all of the scripts. The exercises are exercises from the textbook, so you can practice them. And what else? Do you have all of these? Are you seeing all of these folders?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Images are meaningless. Projects are some sample code type things that are just saved as their SQL Server Management Studio projects. So you can kind of look around at those and see what they've got. And then the scripts, there are some example SQL query scripts that are saved for you that go along with each chapter in the book. So we didn't really refer to these very much last year, but all of this stuff is out here and it's really great material for you. So what I want is the database creation stuff. Let's look at databases. Need to get Edward set up. But what I want to do is create these databases. Now, when we all try to do this, we've seen how taxed the network gets when we all try to do stuff together. We're going to be hitting our little Amazon web server pretty hard, but I kind of want to. So let's see what happens to it if we all do this all at once. So the first database we want to create is this AP database. So let's double click on that .SQL file, and it should open in the SQL Server Management Studio. Do you see it? Okay, so let's take a look at what we have in SQL Management Studio while we have that script open, and then here in a minute we'll run it. First of all, in the Management Studio, you see it's just like all of the other Microsoft products, right? It has a lot of the same icons and things as Visual Studio because they're really closely related. They're like cousins, you know? Yes. And so we have a lot of the same thing. Over here, our Object Explorer, we're seeing all of the information about our server. In this area of the screen, just like again in Visual Studio, we're seeing SQL code, SQL code. So we're going to be able to have multiple tabs open here in this area of the screen if we have many different things going on. So we can keep all of that going. We have status messages down at the bottom, all the normal stuff that we're used to. Now, whenever we're looking at a query, our query is saved here, and this is a little bit more than a query because this is actually creating information on our server. So every single one of you has a database. if you expand the database section, can you see anybody else's or can you only see yours?
Oh, hey,
Can
there's a
you see
mic.
them all? So if you try clicking on somebody else's, you should get an error and it won't let you get to it even though you can see it. But if you click on yours, you should be able to open it without any problem. So even me selecting it is actually opening my database. Now I'm going to expand that. Come on. Nothing. There it goes. Took it a minute. I was being mean to it. And underneath our database, you're going to see we're going to save all sorts of different types of objects in our database. And this object browser is going to let us look at those, make sure they got created correctly, all that kind of great stuff. So that's how we'll be using the object browser. The main thing that we're going to have in our database is going to be tables. And you're going to see that our tables are going to be almost matched up to a class file. So if we were creating a class file about employees, the table that we would create about employees would probably match that class file almost exactly field for field so that we can save things from that class file to our database. Okay, so we have all these different things going on over here. Now below the databases, we have some other things that are on the server, like just security in general and server type information. So we do have a lot of different control things that we can look at, but we'll be focused pretty much on that database area because that's what we'll be looking at. So when you look at your databases right now, I'm going to expand that again, and you expand your tables, you should see that you don't have very many, right? You just have these system tables and things like that. That's all that we have underneath there. So let's create our AP database, and we should see that then we'll have a bunch more tables. So to do that, I'm going to go up to the very top, and I'm going to make sure that this thing is using my database. Right now, it's not. This very first statement that says use is specifying what database to use to run this. Well, we don't want to create all these tables in the master database. We want to create them in ours. Each of us has our own database. So let's change that use statement to use our database. Now, if you don't change it properly, it's not going to cause any trouble because SQL Server is not going to let you update that master database and have security. So it would just reject your SQL and say, no, you don't have security access to do that. Now, the first thing this script is doing in a script, just like if we were working in Windows and command prompt and we wanted to create a whole list of commands, we would create like a batch file, a kind of a script. A script is just a list of commands. So whenever we're using SQL or SQL, anytime we save a bunch of stuff, we call it a script. All right, so the first thing in this script after we tell it what database to use is an if statement to check to see if the database already exists. Well, since we are going to use our own database, we want to get rid of this because we're not putting this thing in the master. So let's take a look at it. And what I want to do is I want to delete this where it starts, where it says create database AP. And I want to delete that down to the go statement after use AP, because we already told it what we want to use, our database. Okay, now we're ready to run it. We shouldn't have any leftover things in here. We're putting it right on in our database, and to run it in our toolbar, we want to find the execute command. And the execute command is just going to run the query that we're currently looking at. Oops, somewhere down in there, there's something else we should have changed because I got that alter thing. Let me find it and we'll run the rest of it from there. There's a lot of stuff in here. Yes.
The very bottom.
Is it at the very bottom?
Like the second class.
Right there. So we're okay. We didn't need that statement to run anyways.
I've just now got it installed and running.
Uh-huh.
Which type of authentication am I supposed to be using? Because
The SQL Server one.
it's not accepting that.
In your drop-down list?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's letting me attempt that, but it doesn't accept the use word and password.
And then leave the 0 off your password.
Yes.
Still not liking you. And what network are you using? Because this brings up a really important point. Because we're using the Amazon web servers, we're kind of the black sheep. We're going outside of the OTC network. We're using Amazon web servers. So they're blocked. They're blocked everywhere. They're blocked everywhere except this room. And
You're saying
last year, only for while we had class, which guess what, makes it really hard for you guys to get work done outside class. So we've been doing a lot of discussing back and forth about this situation. At this time, the Amazon web servers are blocked from the wireless network.
so it's because I'm using my laptop. I'm
Sorry.
just gonna have to follow
No,
along
you're
as
just,
best I
I'm
can.
just watching you going, okay. And then I'm like, oh, that's right. That's why I'm not gonna be able to get to it. So it does make it difficult to do work. They did approve my request to have this room on Thursday. So I'll be in here from 10 until 1. And then I'm in here on Friday from 10:30 to 12. So you guys are always welcome to come in here to work. And we will make sure that the Amazon web servers are accessible during that time from the room. But that means that if you go to, one of the computer labs, you can't access them. You should be able to access them from the tutoring center. So I think that we were able to get access.
And this is
The TLC lab, yeah.
and this is an OT. If this is an OTC thing, one would assume I'd be able to access it at home just fine.
You can access it at home, no problem.
One would assume.
Right. And last year, Chase used his phone hotspot, I think, to use his laptop when he's here. So I mean, there's creative, there are more hunters for the network solutions that are out there, but that's where we are with our security issue from using an Amazon web server. But we're getting really good response and everything's working great. And I think that with our extra time in here, we should be able to get all our work done. And I'll give you guys lots of time during class to work on your labs because it is such an issue being able to get to the server from outside of the classroom. So we've definitely been talking about it with them a whole lot. All right, we created all of this stuff. You guys aren't up on what we created yet, just following along, but you're doing great. Now, I don't see any change over here. That's because the SQL Server Management Studio sometimes does not auto-update because it doesn't want to use huge amounts of resources. So I'm going to go ahead and click the refresh icon up here. And sometimes we have to refresh more than once to get it to show things.
So what were we supposed to do to that line when we were having that error?
Don't worry about it, because we didn't need to run those statements at the end anyways, so we should be okay. Now, what you should see are some tables now. So if you expand your database and look at the tables, you should see these little tables under here. Are you seeing them? You get them created okay? Okay, I just want to make sure everybody was able to create and we could get them all running, and then we'll back up and talk about them and see what we got. Yours didn't create?
Oh. I got it on some reason like on here. Refreshing that. So what?
She didn't say
Yeah,
it wasn't.
Yes, sometimes the refresh is no problem. Yeah, sometimes you'll just like refresh over and over. Sometimes you'll just have to close SQL Management Studio and open it again because it just sometimes is a little bit blocky about it. All right, so we changed the script a little bit. So let's save it. You might need to run this again if you were to have some sort of issue where the tables were not happy. So we can click on this tab, right click, and we can save this SQL script. Now if you just click save, we can choose to save as and save it someplace else. So I'm going to go to my H drive.
Yeah, mine didn't have that. Mine just saved it. Yeah,
Did it save it? So you were able to. So mine's not saving because I'm in the zip file, that's why. So as long as you were able to save your update, you'll have it. We didn't make a lot of changes. Perfect.
Wait, what did you put to save?
Right click on the tab and do save. Now you also could use the little floppy disk icons to save, just like in Visual Studio. Now let's look at some of those icons here across your toolbar. The navigate backwards is an interesting one, so you might want to try it. It can be kind of as helpful as undo, take you back to an earlier time. We can create projects in SQL Management Studio, and they act like Visual Studio projects. So for example, if we wanted to, we could create a project that had all of the queries we create for chapter 3. And that would kind of bundle them and keep them all together. But it isn't like a meaningful project like Visual Studio where the files are dependent on each other or anything. It's just a bunch of scripts that have been saved together. So we could do a project like that. We can add additional items. We can open files and save. Next, we have new query. Let's click that button. That just opens up a new tab. You're in your editor area. So now I've got this new query, and my old query, the create, is still out there, still sitting there in that other tab. If I want to close that create tab, I could use the X and close it. And then I'm just going to be back to this one that I have. What happens if we say we want to float this? Okay, so just think about if you had, 4 or 5 monitors, you could have different windows around all over. Now, once you've floated a window like that, how do you get it back to be stuck? Just like in Visual Studio. I want it to be that big. It's not letting me do it. I'll figure it out. To do it, it's showing me the gizmo. Oh, there it was. I had the gizmo, it just wasn't gizmoing me right. Okay, so we can mess things around just the same as Visual Studio. We can drop things down, whatever you want to do. So you have a lot of options working with this product. It's really, really helpful. So I want to look at Canvas and see what we need to do here at the very beginning. I'm going to look at this awesome presentation. I look at this really, really quickly.
Page 1 of 57.
Quickly. I have some really large presentations. But they have some really good information, so I do like to kind of view them a little bit, at least some of these beginning ones. So let's think about databases in SQL. I told you last time that SQL stands for Structured Query Language. That'll definitely be on the test. So make sure you know what that acronym stands for. So whenever we're working with SQL, we're talking about relational databases. On the Discord channel, somebody's already posted that they like no SQL databases. That's fine. They don't use SQL. They don't use SQL as a language to access the data. So we want to kind of think about the different options that we have. When we think about using a database, there are some things that are important to us. First of all, when we're working with today's architecture, we're usually talking about client-server systems, right? So you guys are the clients. We have our Amazon Web Servers being our server right now. But if you created an application that used this database, right, your application would be the client, and you could have an Amazon Web Server be your database server, or you could have the database running right there on your local network, and it's your database server. But no matter what, we have those things separated out, our client code versus our server code. And databases are one of the reasons they really started doing things that way, trying to segregate their code, because databases use a lot of resources. And so we want to have that client machine using its own resources. So we want to look at some of that and look at how a client accesses a database, how the database is organized, how the tables in a database are related using primary keys and foreign keys, and this is a really important concept. We want to look at some of the relationships that we can have between tables and the way a column in a table is defined. Some other theory important things are differences between standard SQL and Microsoft's version of SQL. So even though SQL is a common language, we can have a little bit of variations with it between one system and another. We want to look at some of the subsets of SQL, DML and DDL, and talk about some basic queries. What's an action query versus a select? Some coding techniques that we're going to use throughout our class, and then a few other basic concepts about views and stored procedures, and using .NET. So here's our network. You guys have been getting a really good lesson on the network this week, right? Seeing how much it can clog things up, and how network bandwidth is so important, even internally. So this is our simple client server system. We have all these clients accessing the database server via the network, and that's a normal common setup. This internal network here, this is why people want fiber and things inside the business, so that we can have a really, really high-speed network because of things like accessing database servers. So we have three components: the clients, the servers, and the network. So make sure you're familiar with these terms, which I know you are: LAN, WAN, and enterprise system. What is an enterprise system? What do they mean by that? What's an enterprise? Company. A company. So what would an enterprise system be?
Large.
Large. It probably is. It could be. Could be really small though.
Powerful.
But what is it?
Ideally.
Huh?
Ideally.
Ideally, it's your company's system, right? The enterprise. So my enterprise system is going to be the company that I work for. So just kind of one of those terms.
So it's not a Star Trek reference.
Not a Star Trek preference or reference, right? So whenever we're the client machine, we're going to send these queries to the database server, and the server's going to send results back to us. So what we ran, we just created tables, and the results we got back were just, it all worked, and then there was an error at the end. So we saw those results. But if we're asking for data, like I want to select all the employees in the system, the result we get back is going to be a list of all the employees, so we can get that data. A couple of more acronyms. DBMS stands for Database Management System. So any sort of database is going to be a DBMS. The DBMS is your back end. Your client is your front end, because your client is what you're seeing. Whenever you are accessing data from your client, you're using whatever API your database management system offers to you. So that's just how you do it. Whenever we're working with our SQL interface, we're going to use SQL queries for our API. Yes?
What sort of things do you usually code the client programs with? Like, it sounds like you could use conceivably any kind of code, just so long as it can connect properly.
Yeah.
Just say, hey server, I need 80.
Yeah, and that's a really important point. Any code that we execute on SQL Management Studio in a script or batch file, we could embed that in some program
Or like even a
and run it
website.
from that program or a website, exactly. So anything like that, even creating this database, we could embed that code within a program and we could run that if statement, does this database exist? If not, I'm gonna go ahead and create it. And now my system is ready to use. So we can embed any code like that. So Management Studio is just our front end so that we can access that back end server without having to write program code ourselves to do it. So it gives us a way to test everything. So really good. Now, whenever we're working with a client server system like this, you know, we're dividing our processing so that we can be more efficient. All of the file handling systems, what are they talking about? Oh, normally when we're talking about file handling, we're doing processing on the clients. Bless you. Bless you.
Thank you. Sorry.
You're fine. But this is a 3-tier setup. And in C#2, we'll be talking about this semester. We might have talked about it a little bit in C#1, not too much. But a 3-tier setup is a desirable way of programming. With a 3-tier setup, I have client code that runs on the client's interface, and I have application business code that runs on the business server. These would be all my class files and my C# code to control my classes. And then I have my backend database server that's supplying all of the data, that's running all of the queries and things like that. Why do I want to do that? Well, because if my company goes out and buys a new company, which companies like to do, and on next Tuesday, there are going to be 1,500 more people accessing this application server than there were last week, we need to upgrade that hardware. Maybe those people aren't going to access the database at all. But maybe they're only going to access the database and we need to upgrade its hardware. By having a 3-tier setup like this, we're able to just upgrade what's needed instead of saying, oh, the server is dying, buy a new one. We can say, the application server needs more RAM and we can control things a lot better. So web-based system, you guys are the experts at this. You're working on this client side over here. You're sending that user request across the network to a web server. That web server then is communicating with that back-end database server, and then those results are following the same path to get back to the client so that they can see what's going on. So if you look at this picture, where is the most secure code running? You have a hacker sitting on that client machine. Where is the most secure code?
The database server.
The database server. That is the hardest thing for them to get to basically from their machine by looking at your HTML code. So,
Well, using the passive back, you don't even see this stuff. Just
right, yeah. Sometimes you might even be able to have your connection string just buried back here in your web server and it never even goes to the client. So, you know, it's something that's not accessible. So it allows us to have added security besides having our data organized and all pretty. I'm gonna go past that, you guys know that. Okay, so in our tables that we created, one of the tables we have is a vendor table. And we'll be seeing a lot more about what that means. But a vendor is somebody we buy things from. So for me at my house, some of the vendors that I use, one is like city utilities. I pay them all the time, right? So they're a vendor for me. Another vendor I use a lot is Amazon. So I will pay them a lot. So they would definitely be in my list. But that's exactly what this list is all of the people that this company pays bills to or has ever paid a bill to. They want to keep track of some information about those companies. They're keeping track of the name of that company, its address. Some of those have 2-line addresses, so they have to have a second address, their city, etc.
And how much money is involved with them.
Right.
Whether it's a debit or a credit and things
Keep
like
track
that.
of all of that stuff. Well, looking at this picture, what's important is I have to add a key, a primary key, to say Here is how you can uniquely identify one specific vendor. So if I need to find information for BFI Industries, I can say I want to select vendor ID 8. There cannot be another vendor ID 8 in my database. A primary key means this is unique. There's only one. Do you guys have any primary keys assigned to you?
I am quite positive.
What do you have? What's a
Security number.
Social security number. That's very much a primary key. What's another one you can think of?
Or OTC.
Your OTC ID.
Phone number,
Your what?
phone number.
Phone number. That's a really good one because it's definitely unique,
Some cookies and passwords have that as well.
where they'll check and make sure that nobody else has used that password. And that's a good way to do it. So in the database, if we want to be able to identify a specific vendor, we're going to assign them an ID. Why do I need this? Why couldn't I just say the city of Fresno is the unique ID?
Well, what if you end up having another one that has a similar name?
Exactly. We can have 17 John Smiths in our company, so we can't use that name as an ID. Now, an aside, because you guys mentioned social security number, and you're exactly right, that's a great unique key. So back in the 90s, a lot of companies used the social security number as a key for employees and things like that. That is illegal. Okay? Do not do that. Because social securities became protected, social security numbers became protected when there was so much fraud happening. And they said, you cannot keep somebody's data dependent upon their social security number in your system. So that's why they've given you guys all unique student IDs, because back in the past, they would have just used your social security number for that.
They use driver's licenses.
Yeah, they were on driver's license for a long time. So I know people have come back to me and said, this company that I work at, they use social security number for all their employees, and you're like, whoa, they shouldn't do that, but they shouldn't do that. Think about you as a database administrator. Do you want access to all those people's social security numbers? And, ooh, no.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't mind if I was,
If you were hacking? So that's a primary key. The key we can use to find the exact piece of information we want. Okay, so let's think about these terms here. If I back up and look at this picture again, the first term they have is relational database. A relational database is a type of database management system that says data will be organized in tables. So the fact that we have a table here pretty much makes this a relational database management system. Before relational database management systems, we had database management systems that were proprietary, which means if I were working with an IBM database like IMS, I used one language to access the data. If I were working with IDMS, which is another database that's out there, I used a different language to access the data. And if I was using Informix, I used a whole different. So there were too many different disparate types of databases, and software developers were having to run around like chickens with their heads cut off, trying to figure out what syntax they needed to use for any given database. It was very hard to marry things. So if I had a company where I had some data in an IMS database and some in IDMS, it was very hard to connect those two and get worthwhile information. So in the 80s, oh, and another thing, IBM was losing market share. They were used to having all of the market, and people were buying these other database management systems, and they weren't happy about it. So they had an employee, Dr. E.F. Codd, and he came up with this big write-up about how we could use this structured query language and everybody could use the same language to access databases if we made them all relational. So his write-up eventually became all of our relational database management systems on a mainframe right now, which I know a lot of people are like, why would I care? Well, because there's a lot of them still out there and they're running and they give you a lot of money if you work for them. But there are still a lot of mainframes that are running DB2 databases, which are relational. They're just on a mainframe. And then Oracle is a company, you guys know they own Java, right? But that's really their background, is they're a database management company. So their primary database that runs on mainframes is all relational. So all of these things are things that you will be able to step up to and use and know what to do with when you know SQL. Now, here's my table. When I'm looking at my table, each of the different vendors is a row, right? A different row in my table, or terminology. Each of the columns here is a different field of data. I could almost think of the rows as records, right? So we have a lot of different ways of referring to our table information. So these are all really important terms. Our relational database, each of our tables is a table. A table equates to an object. We have columns and rows, the intersection of which is a cell. We saw we had a primary key. What do you think a composite primary key would be? What's composite mean? See all these fancy terms?
Composite implies that you have several things composed together, as it were.
Very good. So that means that it would be a primary key that was comprised of more than one column put together, right? So we could do that if we wanted to.
Or perhaps more than one row as well, or
No,
just the
a
column.
primary key is always for that row. So good point. Now we could also have a non-primary key, and we could call that a foreign key. So I might have a key into another table. We'll look at that. And then an index is something that's built behind the scenes by the database management system to make things easier to access. Okay, this is an important one. Look at these tables. Here we have two tables. We have our vendor table, and underneath it, we have our invoice table where they've sent us a bill. Okay, because we do need to keep track of how much we owe them, and we might get more than one bill from them, so we want a whole list. Now, if I look at the vendor table up here, my vendor ID is my primary key. But in this separate table down here, there's not a lot of meaningful data, is there, if we just look at it? This table that's talking about a bill we received from a vendor is going to carry that vendor ID. So if I look at this row right here, this bill belongs to vendor 123. So I have to match that up with the vendor table to find that vendor's name and other pieces of information. Whenever I have a key like this embedded in a table that points to another table, that's a foreign key. It's not part of the key for this table, it's part of the key for another table. All right, they're saying we can see those columns in SQL Server Management Studio. Let's go take a look. Do you have it still open? Let's open it back up, see if you can still get to it. And we want to go a little bit further down, looking at what we're seeing there. So when I bring up my database and I look at my tables, oh, there's my vendors table. I do have one. I can click that plus sign and see additional information about that table. So I want to look and see what the columns are. Oh, when I do that, I see all of those same columns that we saw in that listing they were showing us. The vendor ID, notice it shows the little key here, that it's the primary key, and then all of our other columns. What if I want to see all those vendors? Right click on the table name, and you can actually say that you want to select the top 1,000 rows. Let's do that. And then SQL will generate a query for you. We'll see how to do that soon. And it will show you all of the results of the first several rows in your vendor table. So we can see what our data looks like. Now, when we're working with the database, remember, that's it. We're all about the data. So we are concerned with making sure our data is valid and maintainable and not a big mess. All right, so we can see those columns. Now, there's something else we could do, though, too. Let's right-click on our vendor the vendor. And when you right click on your vendor, another option you have is design. So let's click on that. It's thinking about it. Waiting. Did you break it? Now, when you click on design, it shows you kind of a graphical view of what your different columns are that are in your table. So we can look at this and we can see that the state is a 2-character field. We'll talk about those other data types as we go. But so we can kind of check all of those different things. Down at the bottom of the screen are some additional properties of the column that we're currently looking at. So again, just like in Visual Studio where we're concerned about our properties, we can look at those things here. This is a list of some of the common data types we can use in SQL Server. So just like when we're working with a programming language, we have to specify what data type different fields are. We have to specify what data type our columns are when we create a table. What's a null value?
It's undefined.
Undefined, nothing. Is it the same as 0?
No.
No. Is it the same as spaces?
No.
No.
You
So
don't-
it's just totally unreliable. We can't use it. Yeah, it's garbage basically. We wouldn't want to read it because we don't know, it's just leftover memory.
It's equivalent to a little question mark and the computer going,
Nothing. Now, what's a default value?
It's when we have said, if there's a null value here, plug in this instead.
We give
It
them,
might be 0, or it might be 1, or it might be the word purple, whatever.
now an identity column is a special kind of primary key. In our vendor ID, do you guys want to assign a new vendor ID to each vendor? Do you want Mary over here? Everybody has to go, like, I need to create a new vendor. They all have to go to Mary, and she has a list. And so it takes 45 minutes to get to Mary because she's busy. Is that the way we want to do it? So we want them to be unique, and we want them to be in sequence. We don't want to waste any. Now, that would be a very terrible way to do it. So the database management system gives us an option to use an identity column. An identity column means we want the database management system to just assign the next available number to a row when we insert it. So that way the database management system will be like, oh, the last vendor you created was 16, this one's gonna be 17. So to create an identity column, and we'll look at it again, and everybody always forgets, and it's really, when you need to, it's important. Down here at the bottom in our column properties, they actually say, is this an identity column? Yup, it is. And then we can say how much we want to increment by. So maybe I want a vendor every 50. I could do that. And maybe I want to start at 1 million. I could set that seed value to be whatever starting point I want. Now, once the database management system takes off and starts using that identity column, I don't want to change it anymore. It's not going to listen. The only way I could change it after that is to delete the table and recreate it with new specifications. So, and I can't get back an unused one. So if it gives somebody number 18, that vendor gets deleted, that number is just unusable. So it's not something we can go back to. So an identity column. All right, so why do I want a database in the first place? Why don't I want to just use text files? Well, there's lots of reasons. If I'm using a text file, you guys know every program has to figure out exactly what's in there. They have to do all sorts of processing to read through it. And then if I want to change something, I have to change every program that uses it because now we have a new field and it's going to affect the size of that text file row. So I have to fix everything. And then we have to always have all of this data validation going on in every program to make sure that all our updates are good. When we're using the database management system, our database defines the layout of things, so we don't really have to worry about it. And then if we want to add a new field or a new column, we just add it. All of the existing programs won't use that column, But it doesn't matter, they don't need to, but we don't have to go change all of those programs like we do if we're using a flat file. And we can have checks for data validation right in our database management system. So we don't have to have that in every single program. Gives us a lot of capabilities.
So it's kind of like the difference between using a shovel and a backhoe.
It really is.
Sometimes the shovel is fine and appropriate, but a lot of the times you maybe want to go ahead and use a backhoe.
Exactly.
Okay.
And trying to think of that, like XML files and different file type formats like that that are getting to be really popular, that contain a lot of data and can define a lot of data, are kind of an alternative also. But again, they can be very resource intensive, you know, if you read that whole thing in, that has a million entries in it. Whereas the database management system is only going to give you the data that you need. You don't have to see all of it in a big clump. Now, relationships exist between different tables. So if I have a relationship between tables, the database management system can keep that relationship valid. And whenever we're accessing data, we can access data from more than one table to satisfy our query, so it can be really efficient. Whereas with a flat file or a text file, we might have to read multiple files. Now, relationships can be one-to-many, one-to-one, or many-to-many. So tell me, what's a good example of a one-to-one relationship? Where would you have a one-to-one relationship? I have a one-to-one relationship with my husband, right? There's one of him, there's one of me. That's the kind of relationship we have. We don't have other people involved in it. Right? What about with our children? It depends, right? If we only had one child, then I would have a one-to-one relationship with that child. But I have two, so I actually have a one-to-many relationship. There's one of me, one parent, many children. When I'm looking at a vendor, like we were looking at earlier, what kind of relationship does the vendor have to that table of bills? One-to-many. One-to-many. Because one vendor could have many bills there in that other table. Now, what about you? When your relationship to your classes, do you have a one-to-one? Do you only have one class? Some people do. But in general, no. You usually have you taking many classes.
And then those classes also have other students in them, which would imply a many-to-many relationship.
Exactly. So you can see all of the different types of relationships we can have. Now, a many-to-many relationship is a really hard one to keep track of logically in any way. It gets really messy and things get out of hand. So we'll see as we work with the database management system, we're going to take those many-to-many relationships and kind of bust them apart, resolve them so that we can have an intersecting table that brings those two together. And we'll see how we can do that. But those are our common relationship types. And that's what we want to access through the database. Okay, some other things. An old database like IDMS and IMS, some of the ones that I mentioned, are hierarchical. Relationships can be really hard to implement in those databases. But in our RDMS, our relational database management systems, they're pretty easy. Here's our history. Oh, wow, I was wrong. It was the 70s he created that relational database model. And it took until 1985 for IBM to really release their first relational database management system. So from the time he came up with the design and the idea in 1970, and took until 1985 for that to actually happen. And right now they say, if somebody comes up with an invention, it usually takes about 10 years to go through that whole process of getting out to the public. So we can see that things like that don't happen quickly. Let's look at the relationships within our database. They show all sorts of stuff about all of the different things that we did there. I'm going to exit out of that for a moment. And I want to see the relationships we have. Whenever we're working with a database, we have a special kind of diagram, an entity relationship diagram that we use to view information at a glance, you know, kind of pictorially about our database. So let's see if we can find that. I'm going to right click on my actual database, the Riley RE. I gotta find it. I can't find it. Where'd you go? We want to create a database diagram, and I'm not seeing it. You know, that's the awesomeness about all of these different versions. Let's go check. Let's Google it. So I want to see SQL Server Management Studio database diagram. So this very first link that I have is from Microsoft. That looks like a good link. And that's what I want you guys to do, is create a new database diagram. So let's take a look at how we do it. Do you see a database diagrams folder? I don't have a database diagrams folder, do you? So we have to create it somehow. So keep Googling. We'll give a prize to whoever figures it out. So I'm going to do SQL Server No Database Diagram folder. Oh, look, other people can't find it either.
They're back in 18.1.
Yeah.
Fewer than what we had.
My goodness, don't you love it? All right, so you guys all have SQL Server Management Studio 17. Should we try it? Let's see if we can create one. You have 17? Because I don't think I do.
No,
Just 18? Nice. You. Well, we'll have to make them updated, and they won't. I think they've got lots to do. So I'm going to look at our modules section. I had a database diagram out here for our AP database. Let me publish it for you again. It's a little bit old, and so it doesn't match their database exactly, the one we created. But if you refresh on your modules screen now, you should see this APDB in color. And let's bring that up, and we'll just look at one that's been created for us instead of creating it in SQL Server Management Studio. Yes, sir? So you still have 17? So it should be easy to do, but it's gone. Okay, look at this PDF file, and we'll just look at them, and I'll mess with that later and figure out what's going on for us. His computer must not have been re-imaged. Okay, so looking at this database diagram, kind of small, but I want you to take a look at it. Do you see our vendor? Oh, here's our vendor. So here's our vendor table. So every table in our database is going to have one of these blocks in our entity relationship diagram. And in this block, it's going to specify all of the columns on the table, and we see the primary key. Okay, so we see everything going on with this table. Now, this table right beside it is that little invoices table, all of the bills we've gotten. And this line here is showing that there's a relationship between those two tables. They're related based on the vendor ID. So if I want to find all of the invoices for a given vendor, I would need to find all of those invoices with a certain vendor ID that matched the one I wanted. Now, as we look at our database here, there are some other relationships. Our customers table, you notice our customer table has a little bitty bit of information about each customer, but our order table has all sorts of information about that order. And our order table is linked to our customers table through that customer ID. Take a look at it and kind of notice all of the different things that are being shown on that diagram, because it's really, really helpful for you. And I still have 17 running at home, so I can create the diagrams and get them to you. I just like being able to show you guys how to do it, but too bad I can't. I want to check and see what kind of homework we have. And we really have kind of looked at chapter 2 already because we've been looking at SQL Server Management Studio. But do read through it while you have the Management Studio open, because I'm sure there's going to be some really awesome tools and tips in there for you as you get started. Well, it looks like that's it. We've got our introduction of peer assignment and the syllabus quiz. And we are going to start doing select statements next week, so we'll get started looking at our database. Do you guys want to get out of here? It's up to you. Go for it. That's fine. I think I've tortured you enough so far this week. Okay. Oh, okay.
What she said, I down next year.
I think it down to you. That's what there they are. So you got them. He's really bad about it. So, anytime you see a message like that, already there, it's probably not showing it. Yeah, we don't want it to constantly be going out there to see if it's all up to date, so it doesn't be fresh on it.
Actually, Cliff,
Yeah. Looks good. So,
okay, so like you might.
oh, okay, I'm in your way.
I'm not understanding, like, by major class, are you talking about the new major class? So like major means like, oh, that's the. Oh,
That's okay. No, it's really hard to say words that are new and stuff like that and not be overly wordy. I'm going to stop this session here.
All this stuff is still there. I'm just
It should be back.
What?
Oh, we're just waiting for that guy to get that.
Oh.
And I'm probably gonna go pester TJ to help me with this too, because I feel like it's gonna take me like an hour to do this.